Welcome to H2 Black Thread, where we dive deep into stories of resilience, justice, and unyielding courage. Today's story is about Miles Anderson, a quiet 16-year-old teen who finds himself mocked in court for his silence. What begins as a moment of ridicule quickly turns into a revelation that shocks everyone. Miles's extraordinary intelligence helps him uncover a hidden flaw in a high-stakes case, exposing a massive government conspiracy. As he uncovers the truth, Miles refuses to back down, even when faced with threats from powerful forces. Join us as we unravel this incredible tale of intellect, perseverance, and the pursuit of justice, proving that even the quietest voices can make the biggest impact. Miles Anderson wasn't the kind of kid who liked to stand out. In fact, standing out was the last thing he wanted. At 16, he was a quiet, reserved teenager with messy brown hair that often covered his face, hiding the sharpness of his eyes. His classmates knew him as the quiet one, the kid who sat in the back of the room, reading books no one else dared touch, solving puzzles that looked more like intricate designs than problems. But that was all they saw, or at least that was all they cared to see. At Roosevelt High School, Miles didn't have friends in the conventional sense. He wasn't bullied. No, it was far worse than that. He was invisible. People didn't mock him. They simply didn't care enough to. They dismissed him as a weirdo, an oddball who didn't fit in. And Miles had long accepted that. He didn't mind. He preferred it that way. The world was full of people who were happy with their normal lives. Miles, on the other hand, thrived in the abstract, in the unsolvable, in the complexities of systems that made others cringe. It was in the quiet of his own mind that Miles found solace. Solving equations that had no practical application in the real world, reading about quantum physics, and diving into deep topics of space-time and string theory was where he felt most alive. His quiet nature wasn't a choice. It was a defense. After all, when you were someone who was different, who thought differently, you quickly realized that people didn't always want to understand you. So, Miles did the next best thing. He stayed silent. At home, things were different. His mother, Maria Anderson, was a hardworking woman, putting in long hours at 2 jobs just to keep food on the table and the lights on. She often came home exhausted, her feet aching from standing all day, but she always smiled when she saw Miles sitting at the kitchen table, reading yet another complex book. Maria never pushed him to go out or make friends. She was too tired to, and besides, she understood her son better than anyone. Miles wasn't shy, he was brilliant. And while he lacked social skills, she knew there was something in him that was far beyond his years. One evening, as Maria was getting ready for bed, Miles approached her with something unusual, a legal case he had found online. It wasn't unusual for Miles to dig through online databases and read through complicated files just for fun. But this time, it was different. This case involved a man named Daniel Grayson who had been accused of a bank robbery, a crime he didn't commit. Miles was certain of it. The evidence didn't add up. "Mom," Miles said, sitting on the edge of the couch, his face serious as always. "I need your help." Maria looked at him, tired but still attentive. She had learned long ago that when Miles asked for help, it wasn't trivial. "What is it, honey?" Miles pulled up a file on his laptop, the screen illuminating his face in the dimly lit room. He pointed to a set of security footage timestamps. This footage was altered. The timestamp says the robbery happened at 9:42 a.m., but I checked the sun's position. The shadows in the video don't match the time of day it was supposed to have been taken. Whoever edited this footage didn't realize the lighting would give them away. Maria squinted at the screen, trying to process what Miles was saying. She'd never been particularly tech-savvy, but she trusted her son. "You think this man, Grayson, is innocent?" Miles nodded. "I'm sure of it, but no one will listen to me. I'm just a kid." Maria sighed. She didn't know what to do with this kind of information. Her son wasn't wrong, he was brilliant, but he was still just a teenager. "Miles, why don't you let the police handle this? You're not a lawyer." "I can't just let it go. I need to prove it," Miles replied, determination in his voice. Maria hesitated, looking at her son's pleading expression. She had always supported him in his quest for knowledge, but this was different. This wasn't just another math problem or science project. This was real life, and it involved consequences far greater than a bad grade. But she saw the passion in his eyes, the same fire that had driven him to tackle the most complex subjects in his spare time. And deep down, she knew she couldn't stop him from trying. The next morning, despite her reservations, Maria agreed to take Miles to the courthouse. She figured it was worth a shot. If nothing else, it would give him some experience and maybe quiet the fire burning inside him. But Maria never imagined what would unfold when they arrived at the courthouse. The courtroom was filled with the usual tension: lawyers in suits, reporters clicking away on their laptops, and families gathered in the back to witness a trial. But as soon as Miles walked in, all eyes turned toward him. The judge, a tall, imposing man with a sharp jaw and dark eyes, stared at Miles as if he had walked into the room and disrupted the very fabric of the universe. "Ah, what do we have here?" Judge Richard Whittaker sneered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "A young man too afraid to speak up. Or maybe you just don't understand what's going on here." The courtroom erupted into laughter. Miles stood motionless, his hands tucked in his pockets, his messy hair falling over his face. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't scared. He was just there, waiting for the moment he would speak. Judge Whittaker's eyes narrowed. "Let me guess," he continued, clearly enjoying the attention he was getting. "You think you're too smart for everyone else, don't you? Kids like you, too clever for your own good, they end up nowhere, wasting everyone's time. What, do you even have a brain in that head of yours? Or is it just empty space?" The laughter grew louder, but Miles didn't flinch. He stood tall, and his gaze met the judge's for the first time. The judge, clearly expecting more mockery, was taken aback by the calm intensity in Miles' eyes. For a moment, the air in the room felt heavy, as if the very words that had been spoken no longer mattered. Finally, Miles spoke, his voice steady and clear. "Actually, Your Honor," he began, causing the courtroom to fall silent, "if you're done mocking me, I'd like to correct the mistake in your ruling before an innocent man goes to prison." The gasps that followed were loud enough to echo through the entire room. Judge Whittaker's face drained of color as he realized that the quiet teenager in front of him wasn't some fool. This was no ordinary kid. Miles wasn't intimidated. He wasn't here for their entertainment. He had come to save an innocent man. And with that simple statement, Miles Anderson, the boy no one noticed, had just changed the course of the trial and his own future, forever. The courtroom was filled with a murmur of voices, the sound of lawyers flipping through thick legal briefs, and the occasional scribble of a reporter's pen. The room was cold, almost sterile, the faint echo of footsteps bouncing off the high walls. At the front, behind a large wooden desk, sat Judge Richard Whittaker, his gavel resting like a symbol of power in front of him. He peered over his glasses with a look that could freeze anyone in their tracks, his sharp jawline and severe expression making it clear that he wasn't someone to be trifled with. And then there was Miles Anderson. Miles sat quietly, perched on the edge of the bench in the back of the courtroom, his hands resting in his lap. His messy brown hair hung down, partially obscuring his face, his eyes focused downward as he waited. He wasn't nervous, not really. No, what Miles felt was something more intense, more precise, a quiet determination that burned beneath the surface. But no one would have guessed that. No one in the room could have known just how sharp his mind was. The case was mundane by most standards. Just another criminal trial with its usual cast of lawyers, witnesses, and a defendant. But what Miles had uncovered was anything but ordinary. He had found a fatal flaw in the case, a piece of evidence that, if overlooked, would see an innocent man convicted. And that man, Daniel Grayson, was just one small part of a much larger system that was about to be exposed. As the proceedings continued, Judge Whittaker's eyes scanned the room, moving over the faces in front of him. When his gaze landed on Miles, a small, almost imperceptible smirk appeared on his lips. Whittaker's eyes narrowed and he leaned forward slightly, clearly making a decision. "Well, well, well," the judge said, his voice thick with sarcasm. "What do we have here?" A young man too afraid to speak. He paused for effect, his gaze settling on Miles as he leaned back in his chair. "Or maybe you just don't understand what's going on." The courtroom erupted in laughter. A few snickers, some chuckles, and an all-too-quiet whisper from a lawyer at the front added to the atmosphere of mockery that filled the air. But none of it reached Miles. He remained still, his hands resting calmly in his lap, his gaze unfazed as he looked down, almost as if he were retreating into his thoughts. Judge Whittaker's smirk widened. "Let me guess," he continued, leaning forward with mock sincerity. "You're one of those kids who think you're too smart for everyone, huh?" He paused again, letting the words sink in. "Kids like you, they end up nowhere, just wasting everyone's time. Do you even have a brain in that head of yours? Or is it just empty space?" More laughter followed, louder this time as the people in the courtroom exchanged amused glances. A few reporters, sensing an opportunity for a headline, pulled out their phones to snap pictures of the kid who was being publicly humiliated. It was clear to everyone in the room that Judge Whittaker was enjoying this. He relished in the authority he wielded, the power he held over those who appeared before him. But Miles didn't seem to care. To him, this was just another distraction, another trial for him to break through. The judge's eyes gleamed with satisfaction as the laughter echoed throughout the room. He had made his point. Miles, the quiet teenager, was nothing more than a joke, someone not worthy of their attention. At least, that's what he thought. What Judge Whittaker didn't know, what no one in the room knew, was that Miles had already cracked the case wide open. He had been studying it for days, combing through documents, analyzing footage, running algorithms, checking timestamps, and running comparisons. He could see the flaws in the evidence, a mistake so glaring, so obvious that anyone who took the time to look would see it. But no one had taken that time, not the police, not the lawyers, and certainly not the judge. They were all too quick to dismiss him. But Miles wasn't like the others. He knew the truth, and now it was time to speak. With deliberate slowness, Miles lifted his head. His eyes locked onto Judge Whittaker, and for the first time the judge's smug expression faltered. There was something in Miles' gaze, something that caught him off guard. Miles wasn't scared. Miles wasn't intimidated. No, instead, there was a quiet strength radiating from him, a certainty in the way he stood, even when seated. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of silence, Miles spoke. "Actually, Your Honor," he began, his voice calm, steady, and clear. "If you're done mocking me, I'd like to correct the mistake in your ruling before an innocent man goes to prison." A ripple of shock ran through the courtroom. The audience fell deathly silent, the laughter from earlier dying down as if it had never existed. Even Judge Whittaker's face drained of color, his smirk quickly replaced by something much more confused, almost uncertain. This wasn't what he had expected. A quiet teenager, no older than a high school sophomore, had just stood up to him in his own courtroom and was now questioning his judgment. How dare he? For a moment, the judge didn't speak. His eyes flickered from Miles to the papers in front of him, then back to Miles, searching for any sign that this was some kind of prank, some kind of mistake. But Miles' gaze remained steady, unwavering. There was no joking in his voice, no mockery in his words, just truth. I beg your pardon, Judge Whittaker finally stammered, clearly flustered. You're going to correct me, kid. You're going to tell me how I should rule. Miles nodded slowly, but he didn't look at the judge. Instead, his gaze shifted toward the prosecutor sitting across the room, and then to the defense lawyer who looked just as puzzled as the judge. Your Honor, Miles continued, his voice not rising but gaining a sense of clarity and weight, the evidence against Daniel Grayson is flawed. The timestamp on the security footage was altered. I've already verified it. If you send him to prison, you're condemning an innocent man. The courtroom was silent, but a sense of disbelief filled the room. How could this kid know more about the case than the entire legal team? How could he know more than the people who had spent years in the field, people who had dedicated their lives to the law? And yet here he was, standing, or sitting rather, in front of them, calmly explaining the mistake. Judge Whittaker, clearly struggling to regain control, cleared his throat. You're telling me that you, a teenager, have done something that we, the professionals in this room, have missed? Miles didn't flinch. Yes, Your Honor, I'm sure of it. And if you'll allow me, I can prove it. At that moment, the courtroom held its breath. What had started as a mocking spectacle had quickly turned into something else entirely. Judge Whittaker's expression was no longer smug. It was one of doubt, uncertainty, and, for the first time in his career, fear. The judge adjusted his glasses and, without another word, gestured toward the prosecutor, who was now looking at Miles with a mix of skepticism and curiosity. Well, let's see what you have then, the judge muttered, his tone now far less condescending. Miles didn't smile. He simply stood, walked to the front of the courtroom, and began explaining the evidence he had gathered, each point meticulously explained, each flaw in the case laid bare. It was no longer just about a teenager proving a point. This was about something far more important: justice. As the words flowed from Miles' mouth, the room began to shift. The mocking had stopped. What had once been a courtroom full of skepticism and ridicule was now a room filled with tension, confusion, and awe. The quiet teenager had just become something more. Miles Anderson had just begun to change everything. The courtroom fell into an eerie silence as Miles Anderson stood before the judge, his words hanging in the air. The sharp, mocking tone of Judge Richard Whittaker had dissipated, replaced by an unspoken tension that gripped every person in the room. The quiet teenager, who had been nothing more than a laughingstock just moments ago, now had the full attention of everyone present. Even the stenographer's fingers hesitated on the keys as they absorbed what Miles had just said. Judge Whittaker, who had once towered over the courtroom with his smug sarcasm, was now shifting uncomfortably in his chair. His eyes, which had previously glared down at Miles with disdain, were now narrowed with suspicion. He had never encountered a defendant like this before, someone so calm, so precise, and yet so young. The other occupants of the courtroom, from the defense attorney to the prosecution, shifted uneasily in their seats. The prosecutor, a man in a well-tailored suit who had spent years handling high-profile cases, seemed uncertain about how to proceed. He wasn't used to dealing with a teenage boy who could so easily expose the flaws in a case that had taken months to build. For a moment, everything seemed suspended in time. I beg your pardon, Judge Whittaker finally stammered, unable to hide the surprise in his voice. You expect me to believe that you found a mistake in the ruling? Miles didn't flinch. His gaze never wavered from the judge. The courtroom, which had erupted in mockery just minutes earlier, was now utterly still. For the first time since he had walked into the room, Miles felt as though the weight of the moment was on him. He wasn't just a student giving a report or a kid trying to prove a point. This was bigger than him. This was about an innocent man's life. Your Honor, "I'm not here to argue with you. I'm here to correct an error," Miles said, his voice steady. "The evidence against Daniel Grayson is compromised. The timestamp on the security footage was altered. I've verified it, and I can prove it." The words sounded so simple, yet they carried a weight that none of the legal professionals in the room had expected. Miles wasn't simply stating an opinion. He was providing cold, hard facts that would require no interpretation once they were laid out. Judge Whittaker opened his mouth, clearly struggling to maintain his composure. "You've got to be kidding me. How could a kid like you possibly know more about this case than everyone else in this room?" His voice rose in disbelief, but there was no bite left in it, only a thin thread of irritation. "You expect me to believe that you've uncovered something the entire legal system missed?" Miles didn't answer right away. He wasn't here to argue, he was here to demonstrate. Slowly, he walked over to the evidence table, his movements deliberate. The room watched as the teenager reached for the case files and began to lay them out in front of him. He didn't need to look at his notes. He knew every detail by heart. This wasn't the first time he had examined the footage, the timestamps, or the metadata. It was the 10th. It was the 100th time, perhaps. "I don't expect you to just believe me, Your Honor," Miles said calmly, as he flipped through the documents and slid the first piece of evidence forward. "But I'd like you to see for yourself." A few whispers broke out among the attorneys in the courtroom. Miles' composure, the precision of his actions, the confidence in his voice, all of it was starting to sink in. The judge, once so sure of his control over the situation, now appeared uncertain. The laughter that had filled the room earlier was gone, replaced by a tense quiet, a quiet that told everyone this wasn't just a mistake anymore. It was a reckoning. Miles turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, I've already looked into the timestamp of the video footage presented in this case. The timestamp claims the robbery took place at 9:42 a.m. But if you analyze the shadows in the footage, if you run the lighting angle based on the position of the sun, you'll see something isn't right. The shadows cast in the video do not match the time of day it claims." Judge Whittaker leaned forward, his brow furrowing as he processed the words. "The shadows," he repeated slowly, as if testing the weight of the idea in his mind. "Are you telling me that you've analyzed the shadows in this footage, a piece of evidence that was reviewed by our own forensic team and found an inconsistency?" "Yes," Miles said simply. "The original footage was tampered with, and the time stamp was changed to fit a timeline that doesn't exist." He paused, allowing his words to sink in. "When the footage was compressed, it altered the metadata, something that anyone with the right tools could detect. I ran the analysis. It's all there." A ripple of murmurs spread throughout the room. Even the defense lawyer, who had been sitting quietly in the back, began scribbling furiously in his notepad. For the first time, everyone in the room understood that this wasn't a trivial matter. This was real. This was an actual flaw in the case. Miles continued. "I ran a forensic analysis on a public copy of the video file. The shadows on the video suggest that the robbery happened much later than 9:42 a.m., closer to noon. If you look closely, you'll see that the sunlight is positioned almost directly above the scene. This means that the timestamp had to have been changed. The original footage doesn't match the time it's supposed to reflect." The prosecutor, who had been silent until now, shifted in his chair. "This is absurd," he muttered under his breath. "A kid is trying to tell us the evidence is wrong." But Miles wasn't listening. His focus was fixed on the judge, his calm demeanor unwavering. He pulled up the video on the courtroom screen, connecting his laptop to the projector with a few quick movements. The room went silent as the footage flickered to life on the screen. "There," Miles pointed, his finger steady as it hovered over the video. "At exactly 9:42 a.m., you'll see the man entering the bank. But notice the angle of the shadows. The time of day doesn't align with the position of the sun. This proves the footage was manipulated. The audience leaned forward as the footage played. The room was filled with the hum of the projector, the only sound that accompanied the tense silence. The judge studied the screen intently, his lips pressed together in concentration. "Your Honor, you can pull the original footage from the bank's security system," Miles added. "It's all there, the unaltered copy. Compare it to what was submitted in this court." A heavy silence followed as the judge turned his gaze from the screen to Miles. There was no more mockery, no more sarcasm. What had started as a foolish courtroom spectacle was now a high-stakes legal moment. The judge took a deep breath, his eyes flicking between the screen and the boy who had just brought everything into question. "Fine," Judge Whittaker said at last, his voice almost defeated. "If you're so sure of yourself, let's get the original footage." As an officer went to retrieve the unaltered footage, the courtroom waited. Miles didn't look at anyone. He didn't need to. He had already done the hard part. All he had to do now was wait for the truth to come to light. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. When the officer returned, a new tension filled the room. The footage was presented to the judge, who examined it closely before giving the order to display it on the screen. The room was on edge. Everyone watched as the original footage was played, a clear, unaltered version of the video. The shadows in the new footage matched the correct time of day. The timestamp was consistent with the sun's position in the sky. The evidence was irrefutable. "Well, I'll be damned," Judge Whittaker muttered under his breath. His face went pale, and for the first time there was no doubt in his mind. Miles Anderson had been right all along. I see now," the judge said quietly, his tone now devoid of the sarcasm that had once marked his every word. "The footage was tampered with," Miles nodded, his expression unchanging. "The person who altered the footage wanted to frame Daniel Grayson, but now we know the truth." The judge exhaled sharply, his gavel hitting the wood with a loud crack. "This court will review the case immediately," he said, his voice more serious than it had ever been. "Thank you, Mr. Anderson. You've done something I didn't think was possible." Miles didn't smile. He didn't need to. The truth was out, and that was all that mattered. The courtroom buzzed with a low murmur as the reality of the situation began to sink in. Miles Anderson had just exposed a flaw in a case that everyone had believed was rock solid. The judge, Richard Whittaker, sat frozen at the bench, his expression unreadable. For the first time since the trial began, it seemed as though the power in the room had shifted from the judge to the quiet teenager who had been mocked and underestimated just hours before. Judge Whittaker's gavel echoed through the room, bringing everything to a halt. "Order!" he barked, trying to regain control over a courtroom that was now buzzing with disbelief. His voice shook slightly, a clear indication that his earlier arrogance had been shattered. "We will adjourn for the day. This case will be reviewed immediately, and we will re-examine the evidence." As the courtroom slowly emptied, the air was thick with unease. People exchanged whispered conversations, trying to make sense of what had just transpired. But as Miles stepped out of the courtroom, he couldn't shake the feeling that the battle was far from over. The victory he had achieved by exposing the tampered evidence was only the beginning. He had opened a door, and now the truth was beginning to spill out. Miles walked quietly alongside his mother, Maria Anderson, who was still processing everything. Maria was proud of her son, proud of how he had stood up in the face of ridicule and turned the tide of the trial. But even she couldn't ignore the weight of what had happened. There was something bigger going on here, something more dangerous than either of them had anticipated. "Mom, this isn't over," Miles said quietly as they walked to the car. Maria glanced at him, her brow furrowed with concern. "What do you mean, honey? You did it. You proved he's innocent. The judge is reviewing everything now." Miles shook his head. It's not just about Daniel Grayson anymore. There's something else. Someone wanted that evidence hidden, and now that I've exposed it, they won't just let it go. Maria was silent for a moment, her mind racing. She had seen her son fight through obstacles before, but this was different. The calm certainty in his voice made her realize that whatever Miles had uncovered went far beyond a simple case of tampered evidence. This was the beginning of something much darker. Later that evening, as they sat in their modest apartment, Miles opened his laptop. His fingers danced across the keyboard as he pulled up more files related to the case. After the shock of the courtroom subsided, Miles had spent the last few hours digging deeper into the evidence. He had already cracked the surface, but he needed to know more. There had to be more to the story, something that explained why someone would go to such lengths to frame Daniel Grayson. As the hours passed, Miles dug deeper into the court records and the financial documents tied to the case. He accessed the original security footage, the metadata, and began piecing everything together. But then something caught his eye, a set of financial transactions that didn't make sense, suspiciously large sums of money moving from one account to another. He followed the trail, using his skills to decrypt information that shouldn't have been publicly available. He found it. A name. Garrett Collins, Miles whispered to himself. The name echoed in his mind. He didn't recognize it at first, but as he dug further, he found something chilling. Garrett Collins wasn't just a name on a document. He was a prominent senator, a man with connections at the highest levels of government. The transactions Miles had uncovered were tied to Garrett Collins' accounts. The money trail led directly to a series of offshore accounts and investments that didn't add up. Someone had been using their power to hide the truth, and Miles had just uncovered the first clue. Maria walked into the room, her eyes tired but still full of concern. "What did you find, Miles?" she asked, her voice a little shakier than usual. Miles didn't look up from the screen. "I found a name, Garrett Collins. He's a senator." Maria's heart skipped a beat. "A senator? What does he have to do with this case?" "I'm not sure yet, but I think he's involved in something bigger than this trial," Miles said, his voice steady. "The financial transactions I found, those aren't just random. They're tied to a network and someone's trying to cover it up. They went to great lengths to tamper with evidence in this case, and I think it's because of what Daniel Grayson knew. There's more at play here than just a botched robbery." Maria's face paled as she began to understand the gravity of the situation. "Miles, are you saying that this senator is involved in something illegal?" "I think so," Miles said, "but it's bigger than just him. This goes deep." Maria stood silently behind him, watching her son's fingers fly across the keyboard. She didn't understand all the technical details, but she knew one thing for sure. Her son had uncovered something dangerous. Whoever was behind this wasn't going to let it go. And if they were willing to go so far as to manipulate evidence and frame an innocent man, there was no telling how far they would go to protect their secrets. Miles paused, his eyes narrowing as he scrolled through another set of documents. "Wait a second," he muttered. "This doesn't make sense." He clicked on a series of encrypted files and started decrypting them. As the files loaded, Miles' heart raced. There it was again, the same name, Garrett Collins. But this time there was something else, a series of confidential government reports, some of which were marked as classified. The senator's name was connected to a web of financial fraud and corruption, and the money laundering operations he was involved in were staggering. But there was something even more sinister hidden in the details. Miles quickly scanned the files and found the information that made his stomach drop. Garrett Collins wasn't just embezzling funds from the government. He was connected to a massive conspiracy involving multiple high-ranking officials. And the case against Daniel Grayson, it was a cover-up. Grayson had been targeted because he had uncovered a discrepancy in government funds, something the senator didn't want anyone to know. "Mom," Miles whispered, his voice barely audible, "I've stumbled onto something huge. Someone's trying to cover up millions of dollars in stolen government funds, and Grayson, he was the one who found out." Maria stood behind him, a cold chill creeping up her spine. "What are you going to do?" "I need to expose this," Miles said, his voice resolute. "But I can't do it alone. We need help. I have to get this information to the right people before it's too late." Maria nodded, her heart heavy with fear. She didn't want her son to get caught up in something so dangerous. But she knew Miles couldn't back down now. He had uncovered the truth, and if they didn't act fast, it might be buried forever. Miles knew the stakes were higher than ever. He had uncovered the first layer of a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government. And now, he had to expose it before they silenced him, or worse, before they made sure he'd never be able to tell anyone what he had found. But Miles wasn't afraid. Not anymore. The truth was dangerous, but Miles Anderson had just uncovered a truth that would change everything. The night of the gala had arrived, and Miles Anderson could barely believe it was happening. What had started as a small crack in a seemingly straightforward criminal case had transformed into a full-scale conspiracy. Garrett Collins, the powerful senator whose name was now deeply intertwined with a network of financial fraud and government corruption, had managed to keep his operations hidden for years. But now, with the evidence Miles had uncovered, things were beginning to change. Maria Anderson stood next to her son in their modest apartment, both of them dressed in formal attire. Miles wore a simple but sharp black suit, looking much older than his 16 years. Maria, though less certain of the event ahead, had always believed in her son's instincts. She had watched him grow into someone she never quite understood, but his brilliance and determination were undeniable. She had never imagined she would be helping him take on something as dangerous as a government conspiracy, but here they were. "Are you sure about this, Miles?" Maria asked, her voice filled with concern. "I know you found something huge, but a gala. What's that going to do?" Miles adjusted his tie, his eyes focused on the mirror, reflecting a calmness that belied the storm raging inside him. "I need to expose Collins, Mom, and the gala is the perfect place. He'll be surrounded by people, high-profile politicians, reporters, donors. If I can get the truth out there, if I can get the evidence in front of the right people, there's no way they can keep it hidden anymore." Maria hesitated, but her trust in her son was unwavering. "I just don't want you getting hurt, Miles. You've already uncovered so much. This isn't just a school project anymore." Miles turned to face her, his expression softening. "I know, Mom, but we're at the point of no return. I can't just sit on this. We have to act before it's too late." Maria nodded slowly, taking a deep breath. "Then we'll do it together. I'll be there with you, every step of the way." With that, they made their way to the event. The gala was being held at an extravagant hotel downtown, the kind of venue that screamed wealth and influence. The ornate chandeliers above glistened like diamonds, casting a warm, golden glow over the grand ballroom. The scent of expensive perfume mixed with the soft sounds of a string quartet playing in the background. Guests in tuxedos and evening gowns mingled with champagne flutes in hand, laughing and exchanging pleasantries. It was the epitome of power and privilege, a place where the people who shaped the country's future gathered to celebrate their influence. But for Miles, this wasn't a celebration. This was a battleground. They entered the ballroom, blending in as best they could. Maria was a bit out of her element, but she kept close to Miles, staying in the shadows as he moved confidently through the crowd. His eyes scanned the room, seeking one person above all, the man who had set this entire chain of events in motion, Senator Garrett Collins. Miles had studied Collins in detail. his public appearances, his speeches, his financial ties. But tonight, for the first time, he would be face to face with the man who had manipulated and concealed the truth for so long. At first, it seemed like any other high-profile gala. People moved around them, the soft murmur of conversation blending with laughter and clinking glasses. Miles stood off to the side, his back straight, his mind sharp. He had a plan, and he wasn't going to let anything distract him from it. Then, through the sea of people, Miles saw him, Senator Garrett Collins. The man who had spent years climbing the political ladder, using his power to hide the truth about government corruption. Collins was talking to a group of donors, his hand firmly gripping a glass of wine as he charmed them with his charisma. He was tall, with perfectly styled hair, a polished smile, and an air of confidence that seemed impossible to shake. He had built his empire on secrets, and Miles knew that if he was ever going to bring it all crashing down, this was the moment. But the senator wasn't the only one Miles was concerned about. He had seen the look in Collins' eyes in his research, a coldness, a ruthlessness that spoke of someone willing to go to extreme lengths to protect their wealth and influence. If Collins suspected that Miles had uncovered the truth, there was no telling how far he would go to stop him. Miles turned to Maria, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's time. Stay close to me. Don't let anyone see you." Maria's heart pounded in her chest, but she nodded. She knew how important this was. She wasn't just protecting her son's safety, she was helping him expose the kind of corruption that could change everything. Miles made his way across the ballroom, his eyes fixed on Collins. As he approached, his pulse quickened. He wasn't sure what to expect. Would the senator even recognize him? Would anyone believe what he had uncovered? When Miles was close enough, he stopped. He looked at the senator, his gaze steady. "Senator Collins," Miles said, his voice firm but calm, "we need to talk." Collins turned to face him, his smile fading slightly as he took in the young man standing before him. There was a moment of recognition in his eyes, but it was quickly masked by a smirk. "Well, well, if it isn't the quiet kid from the courthouse," Collins said, his voice dripping with disdain. "What's this about? Another misguided attempt to get my attention?" Miles didn't flinch. "I'm not here to get your attention, Senator. I'm here to expose the truth." A flicker of something dangerous passed across Collins' face, but it was gone before anyone else could notice. "Expose the truth," he repeated, his tone light but carrying a hint of menace. "I'm afraid you've come to the wrong place, young man." Miles ignored the senator's threat. He stepped closer, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small USB drive. "You've been hiding something, something that affects not just Daniel Grayson's case but the future of this country. I've got proof of your corruption, of the financial fraud, the stolen funds. It's all here." The senator's smile faltered for just a second before he regained his composure. "You think you can just waltz in here and start throwing accusations around?" Collins' voice grew colder. "I've dealt with people like you before. You won't get far. You're just a child. You don't know how the world works." Miles stood his ground, his heart pounding in his chest. "You're wrong. I've already sent this evidence to every major news outlet. Tonight, everyone will know who you really are. The world will see your lies, and there's nothing you can do to stop it." Collins stepped forward, his face inches from Miles now. "You're making a huge mistake, kid. You have no idea what you're dealing with." Before Miles could respond, a sharp voice cut through the tension. "Is there a problem here?" A large man in a black suit stepped forward, his eyes scanning the situation with an air of professionalism and intimidation. It was clear he wasn't just a bodyguard. He was someone who had been trained to deal with problems. "Everything's fine," Collins said quickly, his tone shifting back to his usual charm. "Just a misunderstanding." But Miles wasn't fooled. He had seen this before. This was the senator's way of trying to control the situation. But there was no controlling this anymore. The truth was out. "I'll see you at the press conference, Senator," Miles said, his voice steady. He turned and walked away, knowing that the final battle had only just begun. As he left the ballroom, the weight of the moment settled on him. He had exposed Collins. He had started the chain reaction that would bring the senator down. But now, with the evidence in hand, it was a race against time. Collins wouldn't let this go quietly, and neither would the forces that supported him. Miles knew that the real fight was just beginning. The days following the gala confrontation were a blur of activity. Miles Anderson had made his mark on the world that night, exposing Garrett Collins for the corrupt politician he was. The gala, with its opulence and power, had provided the perfect stage for Miles to unveil the senator's dark secrets, secrets that had remained hidden for far too long. The senator had managed to brush it off with charm and arrogance, but something had shifted. The press conference that followed, broadcasted live for millions to see, was only the beginning of a much larger story. Now, as Miles sat in his room, his laptop open in front of him, he knew the real battle was just beginning. The evidence he had exposed, documents, financial transactions, and proof of government fraud, had made its way into the hands of journalists and political activists. The media was buzzing, stories were being written, and pressure was mounting on the government. But even as the world began to unravel Collins' empire, Miles couldn't shake the feeling that they were still missing something. There was more to this conspiracy than just a few financial crimes. Someone, or something, was pulling the strings behind the scenes, and Miles was determined to find out who. His mind raced through the data he had collected. The connections between Collins and the government corruption were undeniable. But as he dug deeper, he uncovered something far more sinister, files marked as classified that had been buried within the paperwork. His heart skipped a beat as he scanned the files, his eyes narrowing with understanding. These weren't just simple misappropriations of funds. They were tied to covert operations, shady alliances, and dealings that reached into the highest echelons of power. Collins wasn't just a crooked senator, he was a cog in a much larger machine. Miles leaned back in his chair, his thoughts racing. The question now wasn't just how to expose Collins, it was how to bring down the entire network that supported him. This was bigger than a corrupt politician. This was about exposing an entire system of manipulation, deceit, and power. If Miles could expose the people behind Collins, he could bring down the operation for good. But the question was, who were they? It wasn't long before Miles got his answer. He was jolted from his thoughts by a loud knock at the door. Maria, his mother, entered, her face a mix of concern and determination. She had been watching the news and knew that things were about to escalate. "Miles, you need to be careful. I've been hearing whispers. People are starting to take notice of your involvement in all this, and not in a good way." Miles looked at her, his expression serious. "I know, Mom, but this is the only way. I can't just walk away now." Maria shook her head, worry etching her features. "I'm not telling you to walk away. I'm telling you to be cautious. There are people who don't want this getting out. They'll do anything to protect their power." Miles nodded, but he was resolute. "I know what's at stake, and I'm ready. I've uncovered something bigger than I ever imagined, and now I need to finish what I started." His mother studied him for a moment, then sighed. "Just promise me you'll be careful." "I promise," Miles said, his voice firm. He had come too far to turn back now. Later that evening, after Maria had gone to bed, Miles sat in front of his laptop again. He ran a series of algorithms he had been working on for days, hoping to find connections that would expose the real mastermind behind the conspiracy. His fingers flew across the keyboard as he scoured through encrypted files, government reports, and financial transactions. Hours passed, and just as he was about to give up, a breakthrough came. Miles found the link he had been searching for. A name, one that had been hidden deep within the layers of data, a name that sent a chill down his spine. Agent Carter. At first, the name didn't mean much. But as Miles dug deeper, he realized that Agent Carter was no ordinary government employee. In fact, he wasn't even a public servant in the traditional sense. Carter was part of a secretive and highly classified government agency, an agency that dealt with covert operations and intelligence gathering at the highest levels. It was clear now. Carter wasn't just working with Collins. He was the one pulling the strings. He was the mastermind behind the entire operation. Miles couldn't believe it. He had uncovered a web of corruption that went deeper than he ever could have imagined. Agent Carter wasn't just involved in financial fraud. He was connected to a vast network of illegal activities. Arms deals, secret surveillance programs, and high-stakes political maneuvering. Carter had been orchestrating it all from the shadows. With his heart pounding in his chest, Miles knew what he had to do. He had to confront Carter, but doing so would put him directly in the line of fire. The danger was real now, and he couldn't afford to be careless. He needed to expose Carter for what he was, a criminal mastermind operating under the guise of a government agent. But he couldn't do it alone. Miles needed help. The next day, Miles reached out to Detective Julia Harris, the one person who had shown any real interest in helping him uncover the truth. They had briefly crossed paths during the initial stages of the investigation. But now, with everything Miles had uncovered, he knew he needed her on his side. After a tense conversation on the phone, Detective Harris agreed to meet him. They arranged to meet in a small, quiet cafe on the edge of town, a place where they could talk without anyone noticing. When Miles arrived, he spotted Detective Harris sitting at a corner table, her expression serious. She had been skeptical at first, but after seeing the evidence Miles had gathered, she was no longer questioning his findings. She knew he had uncovered something big, and now she was ready to help him bring it to light. "Miles," she said, her voice low, "what have you found?" Miles sat down across from her, glancing around to ensure they weren't being watched. "It's worse than I thought. Garrett Collins is just a pawn in a much bigger operation. The real mastermind behind everything is a man named Agent Carter. He's connected to a covert government agency that handles classified operations. But Carter isn't just a government employee. He's been involved in arms deals, money laundering, and even surveillance programs that violate human rights." Detective Harris frowned. "How do you know all this?" Miles pushed his laptop toward her. "I've been digging into the records, following the money trail, tracing the connections. Carter has been working in the shadows, pulling the strings. He's been orchestrating everything from behind the scenes, and now I've got the proof." Harris scanned the information on the screen, her eyes narrowing. "This is serious, Miles. If Carter is involved in all this, we're talking about a massive conspiracy. The kind of thing that goes all the way to the top." "I know," Miles said, "but I can't do this alone. I need your help to expose Carter and bring him down. We need to make sure that everyone knows what he's been doing." Detective Harris leaned back in her chair, her eyes filled with determination. "All right, I'm in, but we need to be careful. The people involved in this won't go down without a fight. They'll do anything to keep their secrets hidden." Miles nodded, his expression hardening. "I'm not backing down now. We've come too far." The stakes were higher than ever. The battle had moved beyond exposing one corrupt politician. Miles and Detective Harris were about to take on a covert operation that spanned the highest levels of government, and Agent Carter was the key to everything. But as they prepared for the final confrontation, one thing was clear. They were up against a dangerous enemy who would stop at nothing to protect the truth. It was time to unmask the real enemy, and Miles Anderson was ready to do whatever it took to make sure the world saw who was truly behind the corruption.